This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
And welcome to the panel number 4, called Lessons Learned and the Future of Democracy Promotion. We have Elisa Randazzo, Malcolm Russell, and Robert B. Unfortunately, we had another speaker, Katerina Pisikova from the Democratic Academy, but she couldn't make it. So, following the program, Elisa, please.
Thank you very much, and I'd just like to thank the audience and the organizers for organizing this, and the audience for actually coming to see us. My paper largely consists of a critique of the lessons learned approach. And so it fits in the panel, but in a kind of slightly warped way. It's called Matters of History or History Matters, and I'll get to why what this means in a minute. But largely speaking, it's a critique of how state building throughout time has been considered in terms of shifts or generations and eras, and how this idea of shifting generations of state building, rather than helping us understand what may actually go on as state building happens, in fact hides certain elements of the liberal agenda that are then perpetuated and result during the state building period. So to just begin very briefly, I'm not going to bore you to death with the literature that I've been engaged with, because it's quite different sets of literature. But to just talk about the shifts, the first thing that needs to be said is that starting from the post-Cold War period, there was a general consensus in the literature of state building that the focus of state building was on establishing or initiating rather liberalism. So there is an understanding here, and I should probably backtrack and tell you that I'm looking at post-conflict territories in particular, so this might make a little bit more sense. But the understanding of state building in post-conflict territory is that initially you need to liberalize, so that there's actually a direct connection made with the neoliberal agenda and the security agenda. So you can securitize the space of conflict by ensuring material well-being to the population, and this may somewhat prevent a backslide into a conflict. And also for this, the political dismantling of the institutions that were present before means that this is necessary for also preventing a backslide into command economy or that was usually associated with dictatorships. But actually, according to the literature, this changes at some point in the 90s. So in the middle of the 90s, we realized that there is a need to get over this liberalization approach because it has caused problems. And there's lots of examples that are usually mentioned at this stage. So you have places like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Haiti, as being examples of botched liberalizations, as it were. Liberal state building thus turns to carrying out democratizations. So this is where democracy promotion, democracy building takes front stage. And of course, in most cases, there's a nexus identified between the success of the state and the democratic institutions, or the presence of democratic institutions. And the idea is based on the fact that democracy is vibrant, and democracy allows for peaceful contestation, where the failure of the state means that there was no democracy, and therefore there was no space for contestation. And in that case, the liberal democratic solution is presented as being not just a solution, but is presented to be the solution to the problem. The support for the strategy is given in the form of evidence suggesting that institutional change in particular is what triggers this taking on of the democratization. And this is where, of course, state building links with democratization, institution building and democratization. Therefore, institutionalization is preoccupied specifically with promoting democratic institutions. You also have elections as being the evidence that suggests whether democracy is in place or not in terms of institutions. And we've seen different kinds of institutions involved in election supervision or election monitoring or election organization in post-conflict territories. So at this point we can say that democracy is believed to require radical institutional change to actually happen. And again, this is the link between state building and democratization. Within the logic, democratization requires state building and vice versa. Now, why is this important? Why are these generations important? It is important because the literature on state building tries to find a logical sequencing of state building into generations in order to categorize different experiences according to different levels of engagement with these post-conflict territories. What these various accounts have in common is a shared notion of evolution and the development ascribed to different motivations and methods of addressing post-conflict territories. And all of these also historically different events are then grouped into shifts or into generations. And I have a ton of names that I can throw at you right now, but you can refer back to the paper for this. I'll just mention a couple of people: Liden, McGuinty, Richmond, Bellamy, Williams, Young, Paffenholz, Chandler, Deal, you name it. The idea is that there is a sense, whether you're looking at the qualitative aspect of engagement abroad for state building or the quantitative aspect of it, that something is changing. So that it keeps evolving, that it keeps changing and it keeps developing. So why is this important? It's important for me to say that the point of my article, of my work in general, is not to dismiss the fact that change happens, that there is some event that is different from a previous one, nor to dismiss the existence or the possibility of change in the future, but rather to question what can account for this change in the way that we look at state building. And my answer is that looking at things through the lenses of historical linearity doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't help us understand what state building is or what it does. And actually it takes focus away from some of the most important byproducts and outcomes that state building has perpetuated throughout these eras of state building. And furthermore, presenting something as a new paradigm, as something fundamentally different, or as a complete departure from something that happened before, potentially leads to disregard the resistance and the resilience of past practices and structures. Linearity, therefore, generates a tendency also to expect that there is a trajectory to evolution of state building as a practice that we can predict and that we can kind of follow, and we'll know where it goes or where it may lead. And also to expect that changes may happen in a similar fashion and towards similar outcomes given similar circumstances. Now, how does this work? And this is where my research will try and explain how the change happens and why it's important. So to present the change in the paradigm, the liberal system, and I'm talking particularly about this being a liberal characteristic of the liberal state building endeavor, but the liberal system presents something that I call a process of self-critique. Jessica before called it apologetic, and I would say that this is something very similar to that. This consists in indicating that there is a need to resolve problems with past approaches. So we did it wrong in the past, we have to do it again. And in a better way. In the late 90s, for example, popular critiques of the state building actually came from within the liberal state building, the liberal tradition itself. And they focused on the problems of fast democratization. As a result of that, then we moved to doing things in a more localized manner, taking account of what the locals want. So we had words like organization, hybridization, and so on, and local state building. What I would argue is that the only revisionary element to this element of paradigm shift is the readjustment of practices and techniques, but that the aim and the key tenets of liberalism remain unchanged. The revision, and Beate Jan agrees with this point, is present only in expanding the concept of transition to account for the faults and the failures of state building. But don't forget that the faults and the failures of state building still remain largely attributed to the local actors' inability to receive or to implement the democratic and liberal provisions extended to them. So what's the problem? What gets carried on from shift to shift? One of the as a key element of liberal state building, liberalism supports the existence of a relationship between market economy and government. So we've mentioned this before. Okay, market economy and government are linked together. This, when it's translated into state building and democratization, addressed at post-conflict territories in non-liberal societies, turns the population subject to the intervention from subjects to be helped into enemies. Why? Because they constitute the embodiment of the very same non-liberal governance, which is the antagonist of liberalism, most valued and most loved aspect of social and governmental conduct. This approach remains essentially unchanged, which is what I would argue. And it perpetuates across all shifts and generations of state building. And it's exactly the same brand of paternalistic engagement with the non-liberal other that keeps being redressed and kind of promoted as not being the same thing anymore. What this generates and perpetuates is a set of asymmetries of power that keep sort of happening across all of these generations of state building. Turning to power itself, we must remember that it's not only inherent to liberalism, but it's also essential to its survival. As much as it is considered vital to the democratization state building discourse, particularly because power is understood as regulation of conduct. And when it's considered as regulation of conduct, it relates to the freedoms of the actors that need to be regulated. In this sense, the freedom that is promoted by liberal state building remains essentially consumer freedom, because it's liberal state building we're talking about. And this kind of consumer freedom represents aspects of a man's life that need to be subject to regulation. They're not negative freedoms, they are to be regulated, they are to be managed. How am I doing for time? Am I doing okay?
Yeah, 11 minutes.
Okay. So this freedom that is provided to the population by the liberal government is no longer an ideology, and I'm borrowing loosely from Foucault here, but it represents a technology of power. Okay, so it isn't something that belongs to the population anymore. So Foucault also suggests that government changes the identification of types of domination, and this is something that I agree with. So this idea of the asymmetry of power carrying on from one shift to the other has to do with power and domination. Power is no longer understood as domination or coercion. It's now understood as happening in the renegotiation of the freedoms of the people that are the subject of the government itself. So it's no longer domination. In this framework, as I said, when power is no longer the exercise of domination, it remains undetected through inducing the new eras of state building. So when we say we're no longer dominating, we're no longer coercing, then we have an idea that we have developed and that certain aspects of power asymmetries have been forgotten and left behind. And of course, this presents a new paradigm which is full of futurity, promise, development, and all focused towards the individual and for the purpose of evolution itself. The regime that is set through liberal state building continues to discipline the population to accept the key aspects of liberalism. And some of you mentioned this in the previous panels. No matter what kind of democratization you're doing, market economy is still one of the most important non-negotiable aspects of accepting democracy as imposed from the outside. And then, of course, you can see that in this, the regulatory role of the state is inevitable. You can still see that the state is very heavily involved in using its power to regulate this. And as Mitchell Dean and Nicholas Rose would argue, this brings an imposition of a certain type of morality. So it's not true that just because it's a new thing or it has a new means of happening, it has forgotten the essential principles and the essential morality that it had to carry within itself. Beatian also mentioned something which we tend to forget when we talk about this apolitical essence of liberalism as directed at helping, empowering the locals. And is that particularly because liberalism is sort of geared towards the protection of private property and supposes that the government, the only good reason for the government to exist is to protect the individual's ability to own private property. She also points to the fact that in the past we used to have that particular behavior towards countries that we eventually invaded and colonized, whereby we thought that they were non-liberal and therefore they had to give up their political sovereignty claims because their governments weren't seen to be kind of geared towards the protection of private property. And that, Beate Jan says, has not essentially changed, and I would definitely agree with that. So actually, and this is where I say it hasn't really changed, where local government and society is not seen to be able to understand or support the role of government as a guarantor and protector of liberal rights, then the territories are stripped of political sovereignty, either temporarily, like Bosnia, Sierra Leone, post-World War II Germany, Somalia, or Kosovo, and to different extents, through the monitoring of elections, through full or partial control over administrative or military function, like the UN did in Angola or the US did in Iraq, or through full or partial control of executive, legislative, and judicial aspects of governing, like in the case of Kosovo. Now, I'd like to conclude, so I think I've bored you to death enough. Ultimately, what I would say that the identification of the continuation of power asymmetries throughout all of these shifts should not be taken to be a suggestion that certain elements or approaches to state building will, for the foreseeable future, always happen. Because this means that I'm trying to be a clairvoyant, and it's exactly what I'm trying not to do. The final object of the research is quite the opposite. To perceive where the shifting and the rising paradigms carry with them familiar elements of paternalism and hierarchization, not where they might do so in future. And this ultimately opens space for alternative voices and alternative approaches which have been previously discarded, because we've been blindsided by this promise of futurity and promise of having an essentially diverse and essentially different approach to state buildings that somewhat redeems the past approach, as well as highlight that these approaches that for now have been hailed as the apotheosis or possibly the only possible way for development still exist within the same liberal epistemology that it always did. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me add my thanks also to Jessica and Matt and everybody else that's organised this event, and also to you for the stamina which you're demonstrating, keeping engaged with us at this stage in the afternoon. In fact, it's always mixed blessings to be speaking at this stage, because if it's gone well, then you find that there's some comfort in knowing that there's already been established a reasonably good framework within which to comfortably express one's own paper, and that I can do today. But there's also a danger that one could find so many ways of framing the different aspects of one's own paper that we could speak for a long time. But don't worry, I won't. I'll get down to the point as quickly as possible. But I do want to say that I do find great synergy and sympathy with many of the points that have been spoken today, particularly in terms of the questions of power projection, whether it be inherent power or overt power. And also the ideas on conceptualisation of democracy itself, particularly in terms of how it's being promoted. But I won't pick up all the threads. I'll go right to the very beginning and start there, because that's a good place. And I'd like to do that by just telling you a bit about me, so you can see my own perspective. I'm a bit of a hybrid. I don't come at this as an academic, essentially, not only as an academic anyway. I come at this with a career done and dusted as in the Foreign Office, actually promoting the types of policies I'm going to be criticising very shortly, and not only promoting them but also devising them, so I'm completely guilty as charged. And I also come at a perspective of being a practitioner, of actually putting these activities into practice in places like Iraq, for example, in 2003-04 with the CPA. So I got that perspective too. And it was that which really propelled me towards academia, to understand better what was being done in the name of democracy. And so a quick gallop, about 10 years ago, I entered into yet another university set of courses, the previous set many years before that. I ended up doing an undergraduate and a master's next door, nameless, and then some more work with Jeff in Aberystwyth and Matt here as well. And so gradually I've come into the academic world from a different perspective. So my presentation, my paper, is a bit of a hybrid. And I'm hoping that it might help a little bit in terms of translating some of the extremely good work that's been done in academia into a form that can be digested in policy and operational activities to make them work better. So that's my background perspective. That's where I come from. My paper, because I'm comfortable with it and it's a good data-rich activity for me, my paper focuses on democracy promotion by the British government, by the UK. The UK positions itself as being one of the major democracy promoters in the world, and it has, of course, been involved as the second big operator in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is very involved in lots of the stabilisation and reconstruction programmes around the world, where democracy promotion is intrinsically part of that stabilisation activity. So that's why I'm focusing. And my question, as you see from the headline, is really that, well, it's not really a question, it's a statement, that democracy conceptualisation in state democracy promotion is quite limited, and there are consequences of that. So that's what I'm going to be looking at. My paper identifies that at the ministerial policy level, that's the very topmost level of British government policy, the rhetoric is about progressive and reflexive modes of democracy promotion. But unfortunately, if you drill down into the way in which the UK government, and I think just a quick glance around the EU and US as well, and also the former Eastern Bloc countries, there tends to be a continual insistence on promoting own brand conceptualisation, mainly of either liberal representative democracy or throughout Europe, slight variations, and maybe a form of social democracy, but predominantly liberal representative democracy. And it's not just that, it's not just the democracy, but it's the democracy itself is conceptualised as having integrated within it certain preconceived ideas of very sophisticated values, particularly in terms of human rights. And so the UK perception, UK government perception, policymaker perception of democracy is very specific. In fact, it's so specific, it's taken for granted, it's an assumption. There's no debate over what type is best for country A or country B. It's just assumed it's going to be this model. And I'm going to explain why that happens in a few minutes. Next, if anybody's read my paper, that's where I spend some time to explain why that happens. Okay, I look at Iraq and Afghanistan to explain the consequences of that, and I'm also going to be spending a bit of time in this presentation and explaining what we might be able to do about it, but the more detail of that is in the actual paper itself. So let's look at why states promote a particular own brand form of conceptualisation of democracy in their democracy promotion programmes when their political masters are saying that there should be a much broader approach. And that broader approach, of course, sits very, very squarely with what academia has been saying for some while, that democracy doesn't appear in one shape, and you can have different forms of democracy, different depths of democracy, and it's a dynamic process. So whether policymakers have actually been reading the academic work, or whether they've just cottoned on in the practice of their negotiation that what they're doing at the moment isn't working, and therefore looking for something a bit less prescriptive, I'm not really sure on that. But what I do know is that when policymakers are looking at interpreting those lofty ambitions into activity, they are constrained by the institutional processes of policy production, and that primarily, in the case of the UK, almost exclusively, is that because democracy promotion is contained within a foreign policy. It's actually part of a foreign policy process. So a policy officer will be looking at democracy in the same way as they'll be looking at all other activities to do with their foreign relations, and those are always to protect and promote interests, and because that is what the foreign policy does. And if you think about it, it's quite right that states will promote policies that will protect their interests and promote their interests. So seen from that perspective, there's a lot of synergy. But the problem is, though, that if you actually look at the impact of that, it doesn't seem to work. Afghanistan's been going for 12 years now, and we still haven't got what the policy implementation set out to do. Something else might be happening there, but I'll come back to that. What tends to happen when states promote democracy through their foreign policy apparatus is that it creates a power relationship. And I have great sympathy with the presenters previously. Helen Mundvid's presentation on power relationships within promotion, democracy promotion, I think hits the nail right on the head. There's an inherent power relationship. It's not an active power relationship. It's something which is existing, which creates perception. It creates perception both from the promoter and from the party where the democracy is being promoted. This is compounded by a lack of clarity on what's meant by the term democracy. Democracy promoters tend to rely upon their own perspective because they're conditioned to understand that perspective of democracy by their own upbringing. Jeff Brito mentioned as an aside about a presentation he gave, I think it was in Tunisia, where he was explaining about the essentially contested nature of democracy, to find only that it passed by the recipients because they hadn't got even the basic concept of democracy in their upbringing, in their social structures. And the same happens in reverse in terms of policy formulation by policymakers in states, because they don't have a conception of what not democracy is. So they tend to stay with what it is they come from, they're comfortable with, their conditioning. I agree with Jonas Wolff earlier, that this isn't a plot, this isn't a Western plot, this is just a misconception, and it's also a constraint, an institutional constraint on policy formulation that creates this particular difficulty in conceptualising wider in terms of democracy promotion. So what happens is that because promoters of democracy, policymakers for democracy in the UK particularly, rely upon this own conception of democracy, which contains embedded and intertwined in it a very sophisticated human rights and values activity, and very often they see it in terms of promoting interests. When there's a call for democracy by, say, an activist in the street in Egypt, the response, the automatic response, is to see that call for democracy as being a call for this brand, the brand which contains all these intertwined activities. And so what tends to happen is that the response, whether it be overt and direct, for example, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, or whether it be less direct but still manipulative through political process in, for example, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya was a bit more direct, of course. We had used air power there as well, but subsequently in Libya and to an extent in Syria, the expectation is that there will be a progress towards a certain end, and that certain end will be the liberal democratic model with its landmark activities of elections and voting. In my paper, I also point out that there's quite an overt connection between the achievement of security interests, particularly when many of these democracy promotion programs are put together. So what you see is the constraint why states promote their own view of democracy with the values and interests it contains is because of the way in which policy formulation is constrained within government, and because policy on democracy is linked very strongly with human rights. In fact, in the Foreign Office, the department promoting human rights and democracy is the same, and it's the Human Rights and Democracy Department. And if you look on the websites, all of the democracy programs are framed in terms of human rights. You won't see, I think it's one bullet which said something like strengthening democracy processes, but the rest of it's all in human rights terms. So that's why states do this. It's not a plot, as I said. There is, of course, a question within that. If you are promoting values within democracy, it's a question of whose values. And the default position in the democracy promotion programs of the UK, as I said before, is that democracy is the values, particularly the human rights values of the UK. And that is a real problem. The consequences of doing this are that the UK and other states like the UK, so not just the UK, but I focused on that. I've seen it through the EU, also through the US is very overt in it, and the former Eastern Bloc as well, the same. If you're trying to impose a message on democracy with sophisticated views on human rights into a society which has entirely different values and background, cultural and social background, what you're tending to do, particularly in a time of turbulence, at the time of conflict, is you're challenging identity, because identity and values are very closely linked. And from personal experience, I can see that many of the people where you're looking at promoting democracy are clinging on to their values and as their identity, and that's what they're looking to do. So you're creating a very high risk of rejection of both democracy and rights if you try to promote them together. Now, I'm not saying don't promote rights. I'm just saying don't promote them with democracy. The other thing that happens is that you leave open your promotion of democracy to manipulation, and I think this is the biggest risk. That if you are expecting a certain outcome and you are challenging deeply held values, there are to the traditional elites within the society in which you're trying to activate will find ways of manipulating that activity. You won't find that democracy is just rejected, you'll find it is manipulated. And what you start to see is that the elements of democracy against which we measure the promotion, for example, elections and participation, are replicated, but in a very hollow way, that people are voting, but they're voting because in certain ways, because they're voting along traditional power elite lines, power relationship lines. And the result of that is you get the edifice, the shell of democracy, but you don't get the social transitions that go with democracy. So when a Western state like the UK is measuring, for example, has democracy been achieved in Iraq? Jeff and I looked at this in a paper last year. We could say yes, it has, because Iraq has elections, it has multi-party system, it has voting, and all these different things. But if you look more closely, the voting, and I'm in touch with the political parties now, still, the voting is done on a very mechanical power relationship basis only for the ethnic group to which an individual belongs. So really all that's happened is you've entrenched the traditional power relationships and given it a label of legitimization. And promoting states find it very difficult to measure failure of this type, and they find it even more difficult to admit to it. You can't measure it because they don't actually have the tools in place to do so. They're looking at different measurements, and partly that is because they have to justify within certain financial cycles the expenditure of money, and so they have to say, yes, we achieved this with this money. And if you're looking at democracy transition, you might not see anything tangible. You might see, in fact, you might see an absence of something. But you certainly can't rely upon elections as being a true indicator of whether democracy exists or not. I've done quite a lot of studies on Iraq and Afghanistan, as I mentioned, and I call this process which has come up there false accounting. This is when the traditional elites masquerade with the trappings of democracy but retain traditional power. And so therefore the real danger for me is that democracy promotion by this means is a legitimizing label to cover an even tighter imposition of inequality, repression and corruption, and that feeds ethnic and other tensions. But what it also does is to close down the political space. in which any local form of democracy that is very reflexive, much more reflexive to local needs, could develop. So you're not only entrenching past activity, you're stopping transition, you're preventing a way forward. And I saw that firsthand in Iraq when I was working with local populations, that a different approach achieved much better results at the local level. But when the centralized system that was imposed from Baghdad came into force, it just swamped the local seeds of democracy emerging. And the same thing is happening in Afghanistan, where at the local subnational level there's very promising results being recorded by the Afghan Research and Evaluation Unit and others with whom I'm in touch in terms of strengthening local democratic processes. But the insistence on centralized democracy promotion from Kabul is threatening that quite significantly. So what can be done about this? And this is where I can use my last 3 minutes just to quickly have a look at this. I think there is a conceptual issue, and within this, I think it's to put that conceptual perspective into a practical methodology. The idea will be to disentangle the concept of human rights and other values from democracy itself. And I think that one of the points that came up earlier was, question was asked again of Jeff, keep picking on Jeff, what democracy system is best, and he came up with the answer, none. And that's something he and I have discussed previously in these terms. It will be a mistake to say, don't promote this particular type of democracy because it's a UK form, but instead promote another type, because all you're doing is replacing one normative approach with another. Don't start with a preconceived idea of what type of democracy you're going to promote, but try to create the space for a reflexive form of democracy to emerge, within which, as it develops, you may identify different types of democracy. You might say, that looks like social democracy, that looks like deliberative democracy. But if you start off by saying, I want this to happen, and try to impose it, then you're being very prescriptive and dictatorial, and it will create rejection, and it may be wrong anyway. It will also be out of context to what the local situation is. So I think looking for a normative approach by defining democracy without specific values is really the primary conceptual challenge for my paper. Can you define democracy without specific sets of values within it? Because if you can, that would really help democracy promoters in terms of framing policies. There's also a second, a more practical and political problem. States promote policies because they think it's in their interest to do so. So how do you get states to not promote a policy on democracy which they think will be of value to them in terms of extending their influence and so on? The only answer to that I can think of, and I've given it a bit of thought, is that you have to demonstrate to them that it doesn't work. And if you can, and just by pointing at certain countries, you should be able to do that quite easily, but the message doesn't seem to come home very easily. Even after 10, 12 years in Afghanistan, it's still no admission that the type of democracy being promoted is not appropriate. But there is a real danger, though, if states cannot entertain a difference in concept in their promotion of democracy, to change it from being coercive to being co-optive, to support processes of social and political reform, so that you can get away from the hollow shells of democracy. Then democracy and seeing democracy as being a continuing process of behaviour, not a unitary commodity to be exported. So looking for a trend towards democracy rather than an actual becoming of democratic. Then it will be very difficult for states to achieve their objectives. In fact, if you continue measuring against elections and parliaments and votes and so on, you're just going to get the wrong answers. and it's recognition of those wrong answers that is going to be crucial for states in understanding that they've got their promotion policies wrong. And just to finish off with the last couple of sentences here, I think that if states are serious about promoting democracy as an activity in itself rather than as a foreign policy objective, then they need to look very carefully at the power relationships within their democracy promotion programs. And so perhaps I think states need to look to themselves for the same type of transition that they expect in democracy promoting states, in states where they want to do the promotion of democracy. It's looking at yourself to see whether you can, whether the state who's promoting the democracy is willing to give up those types of power relationships and look for more co-optive rather than coercive means of delivery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Well, it's been an interesting day. But, here's the last paper. So we decide relief in 15 minutes or so. I'm speaking on US democracy promotion in friendly tyrannies during the Cold War and the War on Terror. And I'm going to be drawing a comparison between the Philippines and Chile in the 1980s during the Cold War and Egypt during the War on Terror. And I'm going to start with this quote by Elliot Abrams. If you don't know him, he's a US State Department official who worked in democracy promotion and was a booster of democracy promotion both in the 1980s under Reagan and in the Middle East under George W. Bush, which kind of ties things together neatly. And he states, change in friendly countries may in the short run entail some risks, but we know that the risks will become larger, unacceptably large in the long run, if there's no opening towards a democratic political order. And here he quite neatly sums up the clash between long and short term national security interests which faces US policymakers who are concerned about the growth of a hostile insurgent or revolutionary movement in a shaky and crumbling but friendly dictatorship. Now, in many cases, over the long term, a transition to a more stable democratic government has been seen to be in the US interests. Such a government's far more capable of garnering public support than the dictatorship. It would tend to defuse such hostile movements. However, this process does involve some risks. The first one is the risk of action, that if the US does foster such a transition, anti-US forces will be victorious during the transition or will benefit. However, there's also a risk of inaction or of taking inadequate action. All dictatorships fall over the long term. If no action is taken, when the dictatorship does fall, a weakened, disorganized democratic movement might be unable to prevent these same radicals from sweeping to power, as did happen in Nicaragua and in Iran in 1979. So the US has resolved this tension between wanting a transition for national security reasons over the long term and fearing the outcome over the short term through an internal-external strategy. This involves external pressure from the US state to pressure dictatorships into holding credible polls that can be won by the opposition and to step down afterwards. And also internal democracy promotion programs which will strengthen pro-US democratic forces so that they'll be able to win such elections and take power. Both dimensions aim at the marginalization of radical forces. The goal is stability. And as I said before, this paper will compare the transitions in the Philippines and Chile, which are quite orderly, with the transition in Egypt, which was not. And it argues that this failure in Egypt can be traced back to this clash between long and short-term risks we've already discussed, and to changes in how the US structures the delivery of its democracy promotion programs, which have undermined the initially successful internal-external strategy. So initially, the Reagan administration supported the dictatorships in the Philippines and Chile, but there was a reversal of course as the 80s progressed towards support for a transition for national security reasons. In the Philippines, policymakers feared that the growing MPA Marxist insurgency was benefiting from the repression and corruption of the Marcos dictatorship, which left Filipinos with very few political options if they wanted to effect change, and could have led to a communist takeover of the Philippines. In Chile, the growth of an anti-dictatorial protest movement and terrorist movement led by the Chilean left produced fears that the country was sliding towards a polarised conflict, which would in the end be won by this anti-US left. So the solution in each case was a preemptive transition to democracy to stop these things from happening. Of course, each of these transitions contain distinct features shaped by internal political forces within those countries, but they do have some features in common. In both cases, external pressure from the US state was instrumental in bringing about credible, free and fair elections and in persuading dictators to step down. This included economic pressure. For example, in Chile, the Reagan administration abstained on multilateral development bank loans, threatened to abstain on IMF loans unless the Pinochet regime lifted its state of siege laws and allowed political organising. It also involved diplomatic pressure and criticism. Chile, again, when the US government received intelligence that the Pinochet regime was thinking about cancelling the plebiscite on a return to civilian rule, the Chilean ambassador was summoned to the State Department and told in no uncertain terms that this was not a good idea. The US ambassador in Santiago also played a role in pushing for free and fair conditions. In the Philippines, of course, it was US criticism of Marcos that motivated him to hold the 1986 elections to legitimate himself. And when credible accusations of fraud were made against his supposed victory in those elections, it was the public withdrawal of US support, including a threatened cut-off of military aid, which pressured him to step down rather than using force against his opposition. So, of course, this external pressure did not bring down the regime in each case. What it did do was put the dictators on notice that US support was no longer unconditional, and it did contribute to their willingness to hold elections. The internal strategy is based on the idea of bringing together and strengthening pro-US democratic forces. Here in the 1980s, the role of the National Endowment for Democracy was key. As an NGO, the NED had the credibility necessary to reach out to foreign democrats who might have shunned assistance from a government agency. It also had the plausible deniability as an NGO to take a more oppositional stance towards friendly regimes than US officials were able to do, by funding political movements capable of actually contesting the political dominance of dictators. So this was important. This assistance for pro-US opposition movements included the brokering of coalition agreements to bring, let's say, a number of parties together into a bloc that could win an election. It involved training. For example, in Chile, the US was able to kind of hammer out an agreement that put its favoured political actors, the Christian Democratic Party, at the head of a coalition. During political campaigning for the plebiscite and a return to civilian rule, NED advisors designed this coalition's campaign advertising and flyers. Voter registration campaigns have also been important. These have often been carried out with US aid, and in Chile these mobilised those most likely to vote for the democratic opposition rather than the regime. In the Philippines, the importance of quick count systems, so a parallel vote count to guard against fraud, was extremely important. The NED and USA channeled 1 million into a Filipino poll-watching organisation called NAMFREL, which operated such a system which helped it to keep an independent tally of the votes kept, meaning that when the Marcos regime tried to falsify the results, both NAMFREL and the NED's official observer delegation were able to present credible proof that there had been fraud and delegitimise his victory. A similar parallel vote counting operation was instituted in Chile. There the regime did not try to rig the election. While these initiatives might seem non-partisan, the civil society groups which ran them were often headed by leaders who belonged to the same civil society groups or political groups which were receiving NED funding. And as I said before, one of the key goals of the strategy was to marginalise radicals. So the funding was distributed selectively. Those forces that the United States found to be acceptable received funding. Those that were deemed unacceptable did not receive funding. Also in the Philippines, US Embassy pressure on Aquino to select a former Marcos loyalist as her running mate in the election effectively closed off her possibility of seeking a coalition with the Filipino left, which diminished its influence over the elections. In Chile, the US state pressured for more political operating space for centrist parties. It did not demand the same privileges for leftist parties, which remain banned. The result, from a US point of view, these transitions were successful, but they did depend on both the willingness of the US state to exert external pressure and the funding of strong pro-US political forces who could win an election. And it was in this arena that the NED's NGO status, its credibility, its plausible deniability, were a key factor. Now let's move on to Egypt. I'm sure you all know the rationale for democracy promotion in Egypt, so I won't go through this. Basically, the idea was to remove the terrorist threat by instituting more legitimate regimes, turning people away from violence. And Egypt was a key target of US democracy promotion in this campaign. It was seen as somehow being able to lead the way to the rest of the Arab world, if successful. However, this external-internal tactical paradigm failed to function due to both failure to integrate short and long-term security interests and the growing real and perceived role of the US state in internal democracy promotion. The external dimension was inconsistently applied, by both Bush and Obama, especially after 2005 because of fears of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and in 2006 because of fears triggered by the rise of Hamas in Gaza, which made the United States step back from its democracy promotion activities. Democracy promotion funding for Egypt actually went down under Obama, which saw Mubarak as a useful bulwark against Islamism. And there was no public pressure put on Mubarak during the 2010 elections to ensure a free and fair poll, and there wasn't. This also diluted the internal strategy. US democracy promotion instrumentalities failed to target funding at political forces capable of confronting the regime. This was partly because the capability had become much more state-based, routed through US aid, routed through MEPI, which was a program run by the State Department. These agencies tended to shy away from funding overtly political groups, especially after the policy shift. Obviously, that would have put them out in front of the policy of their own government, which was retrenching and focusing more on Mubarak. US policy also reverted back to channeling democracy promotion funding through the Egyptian state rather than independently, which had a chilling effect, especially on the NED, whose NGOs were not registered with the Egyptian state and were thus in some sense not eligible to fund democracy promotion in Egypt. Trying to go faster now. Final factor blunting the US influence was a disconnect between them and Egyptian Democrats, which can also be attributed to the real or perceived links between these agencies and the state. Due to the stated rationale for the Iraq War, many Egyptian Democrats saw democracy promotion as an imperial project, and they refused to accept money. Even those groups which did accept money, such as the April the 6th youth movement, found themselves criticised by other activists for doing so, being accused of being somehow puppets of the United States rather than independent actors. And the result of this was that Egyptian secular groups were poorly funded and poorly prepared to engage in politics. So in conclusion, democracy promotion has been most successful when both internal and external pressure have been used together, but the recent experience of Egypt shows that this success depends ultimately on the state, and the increasing integration of democracy promotion into the mission of US government agencies dilutes the internal strategy by making it vulnerable to policy shifts and damaging its credibility with indigenous Democrats. So clearly the NED programs of the 80s were more effective in this way. However, changing the structure will not solve the problem, because external pressure is still required in order to force that final step of a transition to democracy. And when the long-term US interest in democratization is undermined by short-term national security interests, such pressure will not be forthcoming. The fact that democracy promotion in friendly tyrannies is linked to national security in the final analysis means that this tension between long-term and short-term national security objectives is likely to continue to recur unless this changes.
Thank you very much for the 3 papers. Now it's time for the questions. 1, 2, and 3.
And thank you for your endurance in the presentations. That's a long day. This is for Malcolm. I really enjoy the mixture between theory and practice. It's very important to reality. I know people who are on the intelligence after Trace and Afghanistan, and one of the things I kept on coming across from my conversations with them was the policy directives that we would get bore no sense of reality of what they were dealing with. This policy that I've seen documents, I've worked on television. It was a construction that was endemic within the academic field on ideas of democracy, stabilisation, things like that. Now, reading your way, you seem to be suggesting that there needs to be a change of language, a change of vocabulary. I'm just wondering how, you suggesting broadening the disciplinary boundaries, how would you bring this in? This change?
Should we take 3 questions and then the answer?
This is Robert. To what degree, like the Ned's still got hundreds of millions of dollars spent in Egypt. That was not in the Arab world, but a lot of that's in Egypt.
Yeah.
To what degree is it just that governments have learned that these kind of organisations are dangerous, so they've put restrictions on them, which you touched on briefly? And secondly, to what degree is the biggest difference what political space was? That the Catholic Church, which had some influence on the Chilean left, and massive influence in the Philippines, was perfectly willing to support liberal, democratic, pro-American regimes, while in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood had most religious authority. And that just leads to a very different situation. And also Islamicism is simply not being undermined by communism. So to what degree is it the reality of the situation rather than US policy that drives this difference, particularly religion and the discrediting of communism?
Jessica?
To round it up, I have a question for Elisa.
Nice.
Maybe a longer standing debate between the two of us. A question and a comment. So the questions actually in terms of continuity and power. So a quick set. What kind of power are you talking about? If it is not the same power you're talking about, what does power mean, or what does continuity mean? Who has the power over this power, and why is this power exercised that you're talking about? And particularly in terms of the comment I'm going to make, I think we need to be a bit careful with the promise of the market, because I think there has been a fundamental logic in the promise of the market that you were saying, sort of the constant promise of the market. And I think there has been a fundamental change in the use of the market actually. And I think that changed from in the beginning of the 1990s with the neo-institutionalist rationalizations of the market, where initially the market was seen as a promise of progress, a mechanism for perfection. Then the neo-institutionalists says, and they had a massive impact on state building, that's why I'm mentioning it, the market doesn't work because of people. And it's not just individuals, but it is because people are embedded in society, because they're rational, and the rationalizations are filtered through values. So then the market, I think, becomes a mechanism of further difference. So it becomes more an instrument in the absence of anything else it can do, and it doesn't promise anything. And I don't think necessarily state building promises anything, does it? I mean, in your case study in Kosovo, I would be interested.
Okay, yeah. Afghanistan. I should say I still provide consultancy services to various organisations, including the UK and including on Afghanistan. So I need to be a little bit careful on what I do say, but it's I think it's fair to say that there is a much bigger political priority in Afghanistan than state building, democracy, or anything like that at all. And that is just to find a legitimate way of withdrawing troops. So I think that one of the driving factors on the language, which we're seeing going through to Petraeus and others in Afghanistan over time, and to in all forms, is really designed to. The word salvage came to mind, but it's the wrong word to use. To do as much as possible to sustain what's already been achieved, but to create the conditions in which there can be a legitimate withdrawal of troops. So I suspect that's probably the groundwork behind what you're saying. I don't know what the precise mixed messages are, but it's much more than just language. It's what we're looking at is symptomatic of a deeper, bigger problem, and that is that there's a complete confusion between the concepts of stabilisation, governance capacity building, longer-term aid and development, democracy promotion, and human rights promotion, and they're all lumped together in these activities. To some extent, you can see why that's necessary, because all these things do need to happen in some way, some sequencing way, in a country where assistance is being given. But there's a difference between providing assistance and being prescriptive in direction of where that state should develop. And I fear what's happened in Afghanistan, there's been no reflexivity to local conditions. So I've seen from practitioners on the ground, in my paper there's lots of quotes from people that I know who have actually worked at the subnational level, where there's very good progress towards strengthening local forms of democratic process, but completely different to what's being done centrally in Kabul by the democracy promoters. Is that sort of covering the groundwork, or was there something specific you were looking at?
No, that's pretty much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you do raise an important point. Obviously, the political culture, well, just the culture of a country does play a role in its receptivity to these programs. Members of the Catholic Church hierarchy were very important in both the Philippines and Chile in kind of brokering these deals between opposition parties or acting as intermediaries between the opposition and the regime. Obviously, we don't see the Muslim Brotherhood playing the same role in Egypt. I think it does go beyond that, because Philippines and the Chile had experienced democratic elections in the past, which had been substantially more free and fair than Egypt ever had. So at least there you had something to build on. It was more a turn of the cycle rather than trying to build something new. Restrictions by the Mubarak regime do play a role, a very important role. I think.
And were they much stronger than the Philippines and
yes,
and Chile had at
yes,
moment in time?
definitely, yeah, yes. I think there are two factors here that account for that. The first is that the US pressure on the Philippines and on Chile not to enact such restrictions was that much stronger, and that those two leaders could see real penalties on the horizon if they did so. Whereas Mubarak, certainly after 2005, 2006, did not believe that this was a realistic prospect, and so he was able to continue with these restrictions. The second factor is that since the 1980s, democracy promotion had become much more widespread, and people had become especially conscious of it due to the colour revolutions. So we can also see a factor, I think, of certain regimes possibly getting wise to what's going on and trying to draw up effective countermeasures. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think we're in agreement. So.
Okay, sure. I think also it's kind of interesting that, you know, I've been talking about Chile and the Philippines as a paradigm for Egypt, whereas before 2005, the paradigm in the heads of Bush administration officials was the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. That, you know, these people in the Middle East, they're chained up at the moment, and they'll welcome democracy just as the Poles have done, or just as the Hungarians have done. Doesn't take account of the fact that during the Cold War, Eastern Europeans already saw Americans as liberators, possibly before they arrived. Whereas in the Arab world, there's been historically much greater suspicion of the United States going back decades and decades.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and the comment. As usual, you see it more clearly than I can ever possibly do. But I want to apologize for imposing on you on a 10-minute talk on a PhD thesis. So I've missed out things that I couldn't possibly explain if I was given 2 weeks. But to cover what you said, what kind of power, what it means, and why is exercised and by whom. Essentially, that's the issue of intentionality. And I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm not talking about there being a man behind it all or an evil master plan of these evil Western liberals that keep carrying on these evil plans. That's not what I'm talking about. In the paper and in the project in general, I talk about the working of the episteme, where the actors are stuck, they are inherent, and they're stuck within the episteme, and unwittingly they reproduce it. And this is also something that happens in the scholarship with a lot of people that claim to be post-liberal or critical of liberalism itself. Unwittingly, they don't seem to be able to step outside the confines of what liberalism tries to do. I'm not saying I do. So far, I don't know if I do or if I don't or if I ever will. But that's definitely what I'm trying to do.
Isn't that a bit totalitarian, though?
It is, in a sense, of me to say that.
Well, I mean, they're saying there's no one behind anything, and there's still power.
No, I'm not saying there is no power. I'm saying power exists, and of course power can be manipulated, and perhaps you can consider that as being totalitarian. But about what power is, as I said, power is considered to be as a form of not necessarily just domination and coercion, but as a form that tends to, as a liquid form that tends to operate between the freedoms of the actors that are involved in the relationships. So what to me doesn't change is the fact that power in itself, the fundamental inequality in power in itself, that never goes away. The expression of power perhaps changes, but the fundamental liberal power asymmetry inbuilt in the imposition of democratization or state building abroad never goes away. That is my argument, which I suppose goes back to what you said about the use of market. That changes. And I totally agree with you. It does change. And that's exactly the point, that there is a sense of bringing in a new approach and a new way of looking at what we did wrong, why we used the market wrong before, and why it didn't work. But essentially, the direction and the purpose of the market in a liberal polity, that is unchanged. The market doesn't do any other role that is always meant to do within a liberal polity. It never really changes. And the imposition is not different, which is no small deal, when you're imposing or initiating a liberalization or a project of building a liberal democracy from the outside. So that idea is also something that is no small potatoes in a sense.
And we have 3 or 4 questions here.
I just wanted to chuck in 2 points on Robert P.'s very interesting presentation. It's not a criticism, because in 15 minutes, how can you do more than you did? You covered a very neat and clear analysis. It's still of interest for the meeting, perhaps, that Elliot Abrams is best known for the Irangate scandal.
Yes.
Which is, in other words, for having, in the name of promoting democracy abroad, flagrantly violated US democracy at home. I think that might require at least some mention in this context. And the other thing is that as a background factor when coming to think about the Egyptian case, I think it's really quite important to bear in mind that there was external pressure for the Palestinians to hold a democratic election. They held a democratic election, they elected Hamas, and that was the end of the popularity of that idea in Washington. So, I mean, that's an added...
Well, definitely. I mean, that's actually something specific.
Well, it's
specific to Egypt.
Yeah.
It's a factor bolstering Mubarak in that
Yeah.
they knew they could trust him to cooperate with Israel to keep Hamas penned up.
Yeah.
Let's take, we have one.
Yeah, 2 really quick things. So is it Michael?
Malcolm.
Malcolm, beg
Yeah.
your pardon.
It's all right.
I think that me is. I think it's really, it's a great, I love a position, I love a presentation that starts, I want to tell you from my perspective personally where I'm coming from. I think it's really, really crucial. But I think, I always get this phrase wrong about gradually, like optimism of the spirit and pessimism of the will, or something like that. But basically, I think you're letting the optimism of your spirit overtake, the pessimism of your, pessimism of your mind. Like, I got it wrong. But basically, what I'm saying is that you yourself recognise and very clearly elaborate, the very, very, very profound, fundamental, political and institutional factors that why democracy promotes they do what they do. The political, it's the security agenda, for example, the institutional, the budget cycles and all that. And then you're still kind of trying to dig it away. And I just see those obstacles as so profound. And you're absolutely right. To change the other, you change yourself, right? And this is very rarely considered when people are prescribing how democracy projects change. But I would argue that those obstacles are so fundamental that I can't see a way out of them. And for Robert, I think it's really, really, really helpful too. I really, really learned a lot from that. I just think with the Egypt thing, I know more about Chile, but in terms of the economic situation, I mean, we have to remember that where this extremism has come from within Egyptian society, you know, the rejection of you're not allowed pan-Arabism, you're not allowed nationalist developmentalism, you know, and also we've got to remember that before the revolution, Egypt, Tunisia, they were, having huge praise from them by the World Bank. Egypt was one of the ease of doing business index, top reformer of the year. So neoliberalism is a central factor here, I think, in the policies, and then the nature of the reaction, what's going on, you know. Just want to add that, but I think it's really great.
Sure, I mean, for me, what's quite interesting is they just didn't see this coming in terms of US.
Let's take one more question, or two more questions, and I think, Fred, that will be the last round of questions.
Thank you. I just have a quick question, probably for Robert and Malcolm, both of you. Well, first of all, for Malcolm, you were talking about how do you strip values of democracy promotion? How do you strip values of democracy if democracy in itself is a value, and even if you don't see it as a value, it's an institutional arrangement. That doesn't mean, especially because where you're promoting democracy, the recipients of democracy promotion may see it already as a westernized value themselves. And this links to what Robert was saying as well, that I think democracy in itself is very much linked to especially how the authoritarian regime defined itself as exceptional from what was democratic. Okay, so there were many regimes that defined themselves the lack of democracy, the non-democracy, or the endless paths toward democracy in some cases was what made them exceptional. And democracy was an American phenomenon, a Western phenomenon. So how can you strip that value that people are inherently feeling about democracy? Democracy in itself is already a value. So I was wondering what you two felt about that.
Okay, last question.
Yeah, thanks. This is a short question for Elisa also. I really like your presentation. It's very clear, very lucid. But I'm a little curious on what it is you're actually emphasizing in your presentation. You say there's a continuity rather than a disruption. But is it a continuity in state-building practices, or in a continuity in power and how power is exercised? And if it's a continuity in state-building, what kind of implications do that have? Why is it important that there is this continuity?
Can I take that very quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Just very quickly. It is a continuity in power, but by being a continuity in power, it also affects the way that state building happens. Perhaps not so much about the practices themselves, which do, of course, change according to what the actors present as shifting methods and means. But then the outcomes very often tend to be quite similar in that, as I said, the power asymmetries are repeated. But then again, it's something that I need to clarify, because continuity is only it only takes you so far in looking at how power is reproduced. As I said, I don't want to kind of fall prey of the whole lesson learned, this is how it's always going to happen. So thanks for that. I do need to clarify that.
I think what you were saying about can't see how states can change. You're absolutely right. It's going to be very difficult to have a complete change. But where there may be some scope for changes, as I mentioned, is if states can really demonstrate to them quite tangibly that what they're doing at the moment isn't working. So they've got a choice of either stop doing anything or change what they're doing. And if I don't know whether anybody here remembers the two words "Pergal Dam," but and what's that got to do with democracy? Way back in 2001, there was a lot of investigative journalism about the way in which aid money linked to trade had resulted in the Pergal Dam, which had been quite a scandal for various reasons. And as a result of that, the UK took steps to de-link aid from trade. It made a public statement, and in Parliament it passed an Act of Parliament which declared a separation of aid and trade. I don't see anything like that at all on the statute books to do with democracy and interests and democracy and values. And you could argue, and I'll come on to that in a second, that values and democracy are very interlinked, and they are. There is a very complex relationship, and Kirky's done a lot of work on that, and conceptual issues of that. But I do think that if there's a greater clarity by policymakers in what they're trying to achieve, then there would be opportunity to gradually remove the politicisation and the values-laden aspect of democracy promotion. And I think, as I said before, there's too much mix-up between stabilisation, human rights, democracy, governance, long-term aid activities, and there's been quite a lot written about the way in which aid has become an industry, and we touched upon it earlier. That reflects back into this statement as well, because it's become an industry to promote democracy as well. So I think that states have an interest in themselves to ensure that their policies work, and at the moment this policy isn't working. So this may be a way of incrementally rolling back the process and taking it out of that foreign policy promoting and protecting interests module. It's actually, as Moz is just saying, it's really stuck in this particular modus, and which they can't step outside. And the more they try, the more they get become enmeshed in it. Point taken though. On values and democracy, I think that we need to decide. Each person needs to decide. I think perhaps there needs to be a debate on it. Does democracy create values, or does democracy reflect values? And I thought about this for a long time, and you can argue both ways, but my feeling is that democracy reflects values. It's a carrier for values and an enabler of values. And what I think is going wrong at the moment is not that we are that democracy and values are have a complex relationship, but that in promoting democracy, we're promoting a certain set of values which have been developed to match a different context to the location where we're trying to promote the democracy. So we're taking very sophisticated values of human rights, for example, and lumping them in with the democracy promotion program and dropping them into a different context. We see lots of examples of where states promote values without promoting democracy. For example, the UK often berates the US on its capital punishment, on its death penalty programs, but doesn't at the same time say, but you're not democratic. So why can't we do it the other way around and say, well, let's look at democracy, but not necessarily at this stage be promoting, entwined with that, all these different human rights activities. So I think it's not an absolute, it's not a switch on and off, it's a gradation. You need to look at, and also maybe a delinking, so you can have democracy. And what I did as a practitioner, just going back into, as you said, examples maybe help. When I was in Al-Qut in Iraq, a very small town, I didn't go in and say, right, we're going to have democracy today. And I instead allowed situations to arise which would need to be resolved using a democratic process, using my language and my concept. But from the perspective of the participants with whom I'm engaging, it was the local elites that had taken the power vacuum. They were looking at practical issues. How do we make sure we've got irrigation out to this part of the land? How do we make sure we've got enough teachers coming up for the schools we're building? Well, how did you do it before? Who will know about this? What's the practical result of getting more people involved in your decision-making process? Will that be a benefit to you? And gradually, there was a cooperative process that the elites who were holding on to their own power suddenly saw a value in having other people taking part in the decision-making process, and it became consensus-based. Yes, it's not elections, it's not liberal representative democracy, but I don't know that was applicable. The context was that decision-making has always been done by consensus in those societies, and the consensus was becoming more inclusive. And when we're looking at things, and people may object to this because it's typecasting, but it was looking at how are you going to make sure that children are looked after properly if they don't have complete families. And that was quite an issue in Iraq, because often men were missing from the families because of the war with Iran still generations on. And that was let's get a woman onto the group. Let's get two women onto the group. And that way it became much more inclusive. So it's this practical process, I think, rather than starting off with a concept and saying democracy, here it is, or liberal democracy, here it is. Here's a problem, let's solve it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Robert.
Okay, so was your question whether authoritarian ideologies propagated by the state can act as a brake on democracy promotion?
Yeah, well, my point is there are some authoritarian states that use their lack of democracy as an as something that was unique about that particular society. And let's say, you see, we are unique in talking about, for example,
so sort of Asian values.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they were not a proper democracy was this exceptionality of the regime, and that was something that put it set aside with the US. I'm thinking about in Mexico, for example, in 1997, USAID comes out with a document saying it's better not to promote democracy in Mexico because it will have a backlash against democracy, even though Mexico was already involved in a democracy promotion, in a democratic transition. But it was like, if we say you should democratize, Mexicans are going to go, oh no, we're not going to do it. So it's that idea that in some cases, being not democratic and going against the USA as a democratic nation had a bigger impact as a sense of exceptionality of a country.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, this definitely is happening. There are, you know, for example, China sort of promotes itself as an alternative development model and states we don't need democracy to be successful because we don't have it, and look at us. So there's that alternative there. And, you know, just to show that the NED's priorities and the US state's priorities don't always completely knit together. If you look at the NED strategy documents, you know, the one country they're generally hopping mad about every 5 years is China, because to them it presents an alternative model which is set up in competition to their own, and they don't like it at all. You know, also Russia tries to fend off this kind of democracy promotion by claiming, you know, Russia's already a democracy, it's just a different type of democracy. Therefore, no democracy promotion is needed. Sorry, does that answer your question, or have I been... Okay.
Okay, if you have more questions, now there is a break, and they will be there.